They told her the children were a burden she had no right to bring. Standing in the dust of a strange town with three hungry boys clinging to her skirts and a storm gathering overhead, Eliza Munro realized the truth. Her late husband's family would rather see her starve than open their door. She had traveled 800 miles believing in mercy that didn't exist. Now, with darkness falling and nowhere left to turn, she faced the question every desperate mother fears. What happens when hope runs out? This is the story of a woman who arrived with nothing, was rejected by everyone, and discovered that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected place. If you're watching from somewhere in this wide world, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far Eliza's story reaches. Hit that like button, and let's begin where everything nearly ended. The stagecoach lurched to a stop in a cloud of red Colorado dust, and Eliza Munro's first breath of her new life tasted like failure. She stepped down onto the wooden planks of the depot platform, her traveling dress stiff with dried sweat and prairie dirt, her body aching from 4 days of being thrown against hard benches and harder strangers. Behind her, 3 boys tumbled out in succession. Thomas, 9 years old and trying desperately to look brave. Samuel, 7, with tears already tracking through the grime on his face. And little David, barely 5, who clutched a wooden horse so tightly his knuckles had gone white. "Mama," David whispered, pressing against her skirts. "I'm hungry." Eliza placed a trembling hand on his head, smoothing hair that hadn't seen a proper washing in a week. "Soon, sweetheart, soon." The lie tasted bitter. She had exactly $4.37 in her reticule. The journey from Missouri had cost nearly everything she'd managed to scrape together after burying Robert. $4 wouldn't buy soon. It wouldn't buy much of anything. The town of redemption spread before her like a promise that had already begun to fade. False-fronted buildings lined a single main street churned to mud by recent rain, a mercantile, a saloon with painted windows, a boarding house with a crooked sign. Beyond the scattered structures, the Colorado landscape rolled away in shades of brown and gold, mountains rising in the distance like the walls of a prison she'd just entered. "Is this it?" Thomas asked, and the disappointment in his voice matched the weight in her chest. "This is it." Eliza straightened her shoulders, adjusted her bonnet, and tried to ignore the stares already beginning to follow them. A widow with 3 children was a spectacle in any town, but in a rough frontier settlement like this, they might as well have been circus performers. "Your Uncle Bernard's ranch is just outside of town. The letter said he'd meet us at the depot," Thomas finished, his young face already learning the particular bitterness of broken promises. Eliza scanned the platform, the street, the few faces visible in doorways and windows. No one approached. No one waved. The stagecoach driver had already begun unloading other passengers' trunks, and when he reached Eliza's single battered case, he dropped it without ceremony and climbed back to his seat. "You need help finding someone, ma'am?" he called down, reins already in hand. "Bernard Munro," she said, hating how her voice cracked on the name. "He owns a ranch nearby. He was supposed to—" "Munro Ranch is 3 miles east." The driver spat tobacco juice into the street. "But Bernard Munro don't come to town much these days, not since his wife took sick." He touched the brim of his hat in something that wasn't quite respect. "Good luck to you." The stage pulled away, leaving them standing alone with their shadows growing long in the afternoon sun. Eliza felt panic beginning to flutter beneath her ribs like a trapped bird. The letter had been clear. Bernard Munro, her late husband's older brother, had written 6 weeks ago saying he'd heard of Robert's death, offering condolences and sanctuary. "Bring the boys west," he'd written in angular script. "Family should look after family. I'll meet you in redemption." She'd sold everything that wasn't nailed down to make this journey possible. Furniture, jewelry, Robert's tools, even her mother's china. She'd packed their lives into one trunk and pointed them toward Colorado because Bernard Munro had offered safety. He wasn't here. "Mama?" Samuel tugged at her sleeve. "What do we do?" What did they do? She had $4. Night was coming. 3 miles might as well be 300 when you had no horse, no wagon, and 3 exhausted children. "We wait," she said, injecting false confidence into her voice. "Uncle Bernard is probably just delayed. We'll wait here, and—" Mrs. Monroe? The voice came from behind her, female and cold. Eliza turned to find a woman approaching from the mercantile, her dress expensive, her face pinched with something that looked like duty wearing the mask of concern. Yes? Hope flared despite everything. Are you? I'm Catherine Monroe. The woman stopped a careful distance away as if poverty might be contagious. Bernard's wife. You received his letter, I presume. I did. Eliza's smile felt desperate even to herself. He said he would meet us here. The boys have been so looking forward to… Bernard is home. Catherine's lips barely moved when she spoke. He sent me instead. The flutter of panic became a drumbeat. Something was wrong. Everything about this woman's posture, her tone, her refusal to meet Eliza's eyes, everything screamed wrongness. I don't understand, Eliza said slowly. If he's home, then surely we can… You can't stay with us. The words landed like stones. Around them, the few people still on the street had stopped pretending not to listen. A man loading a wagon paused with his hands full of flour sacks. A woman sweeping the boardwalk in front of the boarding house leaned on her broom. Even the horses seemed to still, ears swiveling toward the drama unfolding on the depot platform. Eliza felt Thomas press closer to her side. I'm sorry, she managed. I must have misunderstood. Your husband's letter said… I know what the letter said. Catherine's face could have been carved from the same granite as the distant mountains. My husband wrote it without consulting me. He thought… She paused, and something almost human flickered across her features before disappearing again. It doesn't matter what he thought. The truth is, we cannot take you in. We don't have the resources. The ranch is struggling. We can barely feed ourselves. It was a lie. Everything about Catherine Monroe spoke of comfort, the quality of her dress, the softness of her hands, the well-fed roundness of her face. But Eliza understood. Resources wasn't the real issue. We wouldn't be a burden, she heard herself saying, hating the pleading note in her voice. I can work. I'm strong. I can cook, clean, help with animals. The boys can do chores. We wouldn't need much, just no. One word. Final as a coffin lid closing. Mrs. Monroe, please. Eliza was begging now, and she didn't care who heard. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. We have nowhere else to go. I spent everything I had to get here. If you could just… I'm sorry. Catherine didn't sound sorry. She sounded relieved to be delivering bad news she'd probably been rehearsing since Bernard's letter arrived. Bernard shouldn't have written without discussing it with me first. He's too soft-hearted. But I won't have it. 3 more mouths to feed, 3 wild boys running through my home. She caught herself, smoothed her skirts. It's simply impossible. They're not wild. Eliza's voice had gone quiet, dangerous. They're grieving. They lost their father 2 months ago, their children. Which is precisely why you should have stayed in Missouri, where you had connections, community. Catherine gestured vaguely at the town around them. Coming all this way with no guarantee, no plan beyond charity, it was reckless. Surely you can see that. Reckless. The word burned. As if Eliza had chosen this. As if any woman chose to be widowed at 27 with 3 sons and debts she couldn't pay. As if desperation was a moral failing instead of a simple fact. Where are we supposed to go? The question came out flat, empty of everything except exhaustion. Catherine reached into her reticule and pulled out a small leather purse. Bernard wanted me to give you this. $20. It should be enough for lodging until you can make other arrangements. Other arrangements. As if possibilities grew on trees. As if the world was full of options for a widow with no money, no skills men valued, and 3 children in tow. Eliza stared at the purse Catherine held out like a peace offering, like absolution. $20. A fortune and an insult all at once. Enough to survive for a few weeks, maybe a month if they were careful. And then what? Take it, Catherine said, and now she did sound almost sorry. Almost. Please, it's all we can offer. The silence stretched. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked. The man with the flour sacks resumed loading his wagon, the moment of drama apparently over. The woman with the broom had already disappeared inside. Eliza's hand shook as she took the purse. The leather was soft, expensive. Like everything else about Catherine Monroe, it spoke of a comfort Eliza would never know. "Thank you," she whispered, because what else was there to say? Catherine nodded once, already turning away. "The boarding house is just there. Mrs. Pritchard runs it. Tell her I sent you." She paused, glanced back. "And Mrs. Monroe?" In the future, it would be wise to confirm arrangements before undertaking such a journey. A woman alone must be more careful. Then she was walking away, her skirts swishing against the wooden planks, her back straight and righteous. Eliza watched her go and felt something inside her chest crack open. Not her heart, that had already broken when Robert died. This was something deeper. Hope, maybe. The last fragile belief that the world contained more kindness than cruelty. "Mama?" She looked down to find all three boys staring at her with identical expressions of confusion and fear. They'd been too young to understand much when their father died. They'd cried because she'd cried, grieved because the house felt empty. But they hadn't grasped the full weight of loss. They understood now. She could see it in Thomas's eyes, the exact moment childhood innocence met adult reality. They were unwanted, all of them. There was no safety net, no family waiting with open arms, just a strange town, a hostile world, and a mother who had gambled everything on a promise written in ink that meant nothing. "We're going to be fine," she said, gathering them close. David was crying now, silent tears that soaked into her already ruined dress. Samuel's face had gone blank, shut down. Thomas just stared at the mountains, his jaw tight in a way that made him look startlingly like his father. "We'll stay at the boarding house tonight. Tomorrow we'll figure out our next step." What next step? The question screamed in her mind even as she spoke false comfort. She had no skills beyond keeping house and raising children. No connections, no prospects. In Missouri there had been at least the possibility of work, laundry, perhaps, or mending. But here? In a rough frontier town full of men and few families? She picked up their trunk. God, how light it was, how little they'd managed to save, and started toward the boarding house. Behind her the boys followed in silent procession, three small shadows cast long by the setting sun. Mrs. Pritchard turned out to be a heavy-set woman with kind eyes and business sense sharp enough to cut glass. She looked Eliza up and down, catalogued the threadbare dress and desperate eyes, and quoted a price that was almost fair. $1.50 a night for the room, she said, wiping her hands on her apron. Breakfast included, but other meals are extra. Payment in advance. Eliza counted out $3, watching a full tenth of her remaining resources disappear into Mrs. Pritchard's capable hands. The room was small, clean, and utterly cheerless. One narrow bed, a washstand, walls so thin she could hear every sound from neighboring rooms. The boys would sleep on the floor. She would lie awake all night trying to solve an impossible equation. "There's stew if you're hungry," Mrs. Pritchard offered, her voice gentling slightly. 20 cents a bowl. Eliza did the arithmetic in her head. 80 cents for 4 bowls. She had $17.37 left. At this rate, they'd be penniless in 3 weeks. "Just for the boys," she said. "I'm not hungry." Another lie. She was starving, but hunger was something she could bear. Watching her children go hungry was not. Mrs. Pritchard nodded, understanding more than Eliza wanted her to. "I'll bring it up." While the boys ate, shoveling stew into their mouths like they hadn't seen food in days, which wasn't far from truth, Eliza stood at the small window and watched the town settle into evening. Lamps were being lit, families gathering for dinner, the world continuing on, indifferent to her crisis. She thought about Robert, wondered what he would say if he could see her now. He'd been a good man, gentle and hard-working, but he'd never quite managed to get ahead. Always one bad harvest, one sick animal, one stroke of bad luck away from disaster. And then the fever had come, and he'd been gone in 3 days, leaving her with nothing but debts and a promise from his brother that had turned to smoke. "Mama?" Thomas appeared at her elbow, bowl empty, face still hungry. "What are we going to do?" She almost told him the truth. "I don't know. I'm terrified. I made a terrible mistake bringing us here, and now we're trapped." But he was 9 years old, and he'd already lost his father. He didn't need to lose his mother's strength, too. "We're going to rest tonight," she said instead. "Tomorrow I'll look for work. There must be someone who needs help. We'll figure it out." He nodded, wanting to believe her. God, she wished she could believe herself. That night, she lay in the narrow bed with David curled against her side and Samuel at her feet, listening to Thomas's breathing from his spot on the floor. The sounds of the town drifted through the thin walls, laughter from the saloon, the creak of wagons, a baby crying somewhere close. Normal sounds of normal lives carrying on. She tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. What was there to say? Help us? She'd been praying for help since Robert died. Save us. God seemed to specialize in teaching hard lessons about self-reliance. Instead, she made plans. Tomorrow she would visit every business in town, offer to clean, cook, mend. Surely someone needed help. Surely $20 could become 40, could become 60, could buy them time to figure out something more permanent. The alternative, returning to Missouri with nothing, admitting defeat, throwing herself on the mercy of a community that had already given all they could, was unthinkable. She must have dozed eventually because she woke to weak sunlight and the sound of the town stirring to life. Her body ached from tension in the hard mattress. David was still asleep, his face peaceful in a way that made her chest hurt. Samuel had already woken and was sitting by the window, watching the street with ancient eyes. "Good morning," she whispered. He didn't answer, just kept staring out at the world that had rejected them. Eliza rose, washed in the cold water from the basin, and did her best to make herself presentable. The dress was wrinkled, stained from travel, but she brushed it out and pinned her hair with careful attention. First impressions mattered. She needed to look competent, capable, worthy of employment. Mrs. Pritchard had left a breakfast of biscuits and weak coffee outside their door. Eliza made sure the boys ate before attempting anything herself, then set out to face the town in daylight. Redemption looked even smaller by day, even more harsh. The mountains that had seemed majestic last night now felt oppressive, hemming them in. She walked the length of the main street, stopping at each establishment. The mercantile owner barely looked up from his ledger. "Don't need help. Try the boarding house." The woman at the boarding house, not Mrs. Pritchard, someone younger, sharper, laughed outright. "We're full up on staff, and we don't hire women with children. Too much disruption." The saloon owner looked her up and down in a way that made her skin crawl. "I got positions available, but not the kind you'd be interested in, I'm guessing." She fled that doorway with heat in her cheeks and fury in her belly. The restaurant, the telegraph office, the feed store. Door after door, the answer was the same. No work, no opportunities. No place for a widow with 3 children and no husband to vouch for her respectability. By mid-morning, her feet ached and her hope had worn through. She stood on the boardwalk outside the general store, watching miners and ranchers go about their business, and felt the full weight of her situation settle over her like a physical thing. She had no options. None. She could spend her $17 and delay the inevitable by a few weeks, or she could... What? There was no or. There was only this, slow starvation in a town that didn't want them. "Mama!" Thomas's voice, sharp with alarm. She turned to see him running toward her, David's hand clasped in his, Samuel trailing behind. They weren't supposed to be out of the room. She told them to stay put, stay quiet, stay invisible. "What's wrong?" She caught Thomas by the shoulders, checked each face for injury, illness, disaster. "There's a storm coming," Thomas panted. "Big one. Mr. Pritchard said so. Said everyone should get inside, batten down." Eliza looked up. The sky had been clear an hour ago, but now clouds were rolling in from the west, dark and heavy with threat. The temperature had dropped, wind picking up in gusts that sent dust spiraling down the street. People were indeed hurrying now, securing shutters, bringing in goods from boardwalks. The casual morning bustle had turned urgent. "Back to the boarding house," Eliza said, gathering her sons. "Quickly now." They made it halfway there before the first drops fell. By the time they reached Mrs. Pritchard's door, the sky had opened up completely. Rain hammered down in sheets, turning the street to a river of mud within seconds. Thunder rolled across the mountains, and lightning split the darkening sky. Mrs. Pritchard was in the hallway, handing out lanterns. "Going to be a rough one," she said, not unkindly. "Best stay in your room. I'll bring up dinner later." Another expense. But what choice was there? Eliza herded the boys upstairs and into their small room. The window rattled in its frame. Rain pounded against the glass like it was trying to break through. David whimpered and pressed against her, and she wrapped him in her arms, making soothing sounds that felt like more lies. The storm raged for hours. Eliza sat on the bed with her children clustered around her, watching the world outside dissolve into chaos. This was how it would end, she thought distantly. Not with dignity or grace, but with slow erosion. She'd run out of money. They'd be turned out. And then, she didn't let herself finish that thought. "Tell us a story, Mama," Samuel whispered, his small voice barely audible over the thunder. She didn't want to. She wanted to sit in silence and let despair have its way with her, but his eyes were so hopeful, and David had stopped whimpering, waiting for her answer. "What kind of story?" "A happy one," Thomas said quietly, "with a good ending." Something in her chest cracked a little wider. "I don't know if I remember any of those." "Make one up," Samuel urged. "Please?" So she did. She told them about a family lost in the wilderness who found a magical cabin where everything they needed appeared just when they needed it. She described impossible gardens and talking animals and skies that never stormed. She spun a fairy tale from nothing, and her children listened with the desperate attention of souls seeking refuge. When she finished, David was asleep. Samuel's eyes were drooping. Only Thomas still watched her with that too-knowing gaze. "That's not real," he said softly. "Is it?" "No," she admitted. "It's not real. What's going to happen to us?" "Really?" She could lie again. Should lie. But Thomas deserved better than that. "I don't know, sweetheart. I honestly don't know." He nodded, accepting this truth with a gravity no child should possess. "We'll be okay, though. You'll figure something out. You always do." His faith in her was terrifying. She wanted to tell him she wasn't that strong, wasn't that capable. She was just a woman who'd made all the wrong choices and run out of roads to travel, but instead she kissed his forehead and said, "Get some sleep." The storm continued into the night. Eliza dozed fitfully, waking to thunder, to the sound of wind tearing at the building's roof, to her own racing heart. Each time she woke, the same thought circled. $17, 3 children, no work, no future. Sometime near dawn, the rain finally stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse than the noise. Eliza rose, careful not to wake the boys, and went to the window. The street below was a disaster of mud and debris. A wagon had overturned, shingles littered the ground, but the sky was clearing, stars visible through breaking clouds. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass and let herself cry. Quiet, helpless tears that changed nothing. She'd been so certain that coming west was the answer, that Bernard Monroe's letter was salvation, that somehow, despite everything, they'd be okay. She'd been wrong. When the sun finally rose, painting the muddy street in shades of gold, Eliza washed her face and woke her children. Another day. Another round of doors that wouldn't open. Another night closer to having no choice left at all. "Where are we going, Mama?" David asked as she helped him into his coat. She didn't know. But she couldn't say that, couldn't let them see her completely break. "Out," she said. "We're going out." They walked through the damaged town, stepping over fallen branches and around puddles that reflected the too bright sky. Eliza barely saw any of it. Her mind was elsewhere, trying to solve problems that had no solutions. She was so lost in her thoughts that she didn't notice the man watching them until Thomas tugged at her sleeve. "Mama," that man's staring. She looked up. Across the street, leaning against a hitching post outside the feed store, stood a rancher. Tall, weathered, maybe 40 years old. He wore work clothes stained with mud and effort, a hat pulled low over eyes that nevertheless seemed to see everything. He was staring. Not with the leering assessment of the saloon owner, but with something else. Concern, maybe. Or simple curiosity about the spectacle of a woman and 3 boys standing lost in the middle of a town that clearly didn't want them. Their eyes met across the muddy expanse. Eliza lifted her chin, refusing to look away first. She might be desperate, but she wasn't broken. Not yet. The rancher straightened, started walking toward them. Eliza's heart kicked hard against her ribs. She didn't know this man, didn't know what he wanted. In her experience, when strange men approached desperate women, it rarely ended well. She gathered her sons closer, prepared to flee. But the man stopped a respectful distance away and touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough but not unkind. "I don't mean to intrude, but I couldn't help noticing. Are you all right?" The question was so unexpected, so genuinely concerned, that for a moment Eliza couldn't answer. When had anyone last asked if she was all right? When had anyone cared enough to notice she wasn't? "We're fine," she managed the automatic lie. The rancher's eyes, gray she noticed, like storm clouds, flickered to her sons, to their threadbare clothes and hungry faces, then back to her. "Don't mean to contradict a lady," he said carefully, "but you don't look fine. You look lost." "We're not lost." Her voice came out sharper than intended. "We know exactly where we are." "That's so?" He shifted his weight, patient as a mountain. "Where would that be?" "Nowhere. Trapped. At the end of everything." "That's not your concern," she said instead. "No, ma'am, I suppose it's not." He was quiet for a moment, considering. Then, "Name's Caleb Hartman. I run a ranch about 5 miles east of here. Came in for supplies, saw the storm damage." Another pause. "Saw you yesterday, too, at the depot. Heard what Catherine Monroe said to you." Shame flooded through her, hot and acidic. Of course he'd heard. Everyone had heard. Her rejection had been public entertainment. "If you're here to offer pity, I'm here to offer shelter." The words hung in the air between them, impossible. Eliza stared at him, waiting for the catch, the cruel twist. Men didn't offer shelter to strange women without expecting payment of one kind or another. "I have a cabin," Caleb continued, his voice steady, matter-of-fact. "Small, but sound. Weathered the storm just fine. It's been empty since my last hired hand moved on. You and your boys could stay there, temporarily," he added quickly, "until you figure out your next step." "Why?" The question escaped before she could stop it. "Why would you do that?" His jaw tightened slightly and something passed across his face. Old pain, maybe, or memory. "Let's just say I know what it's like to have nowhere left to turn, and I remember what it felt like when someone offered me a hand instead of judgment." Eliza's mind raced. This could be a trap. This could be exactly what it looked like. Charity with strings attached. She should refuse. Should protect her dignity, her sons, her already battered pride. But dignity didn't keep children fed. Pride didn't provide shelter. "What would you expect in return?" She forced herself to ask the ugly question. "For this cabin?" Understanding flickered in Caleb's eyes. "Nothing you're thinking, ma'am. I run a working ranch. Always need help. You can work if you choose to, earn your keep, but there's no expectation beyond that. The cabin is yours, whether you work or not. I'm just offering safety, nothing more." It was too good. Had to be. The world didn't work this way. "I don't know you," she said, even as hope began its dangerous climb in her chest. "You could be a threat. I know." He stepped back, giving her space. "I'm not asking you to trust me right now. I'm asking you to think about your options. You got any?" The brutal honesty of the question struck like a physical blow. Because no, she didn't have options. She had $17 and a town that had made clear she wasn't welcome. "Mama?" Thomas's voice, small and uncertain. "Is he a good man?" Out of the mouths of children, the question that mattered most. Eliza looked at Caleb Hartman, really looked. Saw the lines around his eyes that spoke of squinting into sun and wind. Saw hands calloused from work, not violence. Saw a wedding ring on his left hand, worn thin but still there. "Are you?" she asked. "A good man?" "I try to be." His answer was simple, unadorned. "Can't promise I always succeed, but I can promise you'll be safe on my land. You and your boys." The wedding ring. "Your wife is gone." His voice went flat. 3 years now. It's just me out there. A widower, then. Alone like she was alone. Maybe that's why he'd noticed her. Recognized something of his own loss in her eyes. "I need to think about it," Eliza heard herself say. Caleb nodded, unsurprised. "Fair enough. I'll be at the feed store for another hour. After that, I'm heading back to the ranch. If you decide to come, meet me there. If not," he shrugged, "I hope you find what you're looking for." He walked away before she could respond, leaving her standing in the muddy street with her sons and a choice that felt more like a trap. "Are we going with him?" Samuel asked. "I don't know," Eliza admitted. "We should," Thomas said quietly. "Mama, we should. You know we should." She did know. That was the terrible part. She knew that staying here meant slow starvation, knew that going with a stranger might be dangerous, but at least it was a chance. Knew that her children deserved better than watching their mother fail to protect them. "Give me a minute to think," she said. But there was nothing to think about. The decision had already been made the moment Catherine Monroe walked away. Maybe even before that. Maybe the moment Robert died and left her alone to navigate a world that didn't want widows with children. Eliza looked down at her sons, at Thomas trying so hard to be brave, at Samuel's shuttered face, at David's innocent confusion, and made the only choice left to her. "We're going," she said. "Get your things." 20 minutes later, Eliza stood beside Caleb Hartman's wagon with everything she owned loaded in the back and her heart hammering against her ribs like it was trying to escape. The boys sat on the wagon bed, Thomas holding David while Samuel gripped the side rails with white-knuckled determination. None of them spoke. The enormity of what they were doing, climbing into a stranger's wagon and leaving the only civilization for miles, had rendered them all silent. Caleb finished securing the supplies he'd purchased and turned to face her. "You change your mind. Now's the time to say so." Eliza looked back at the town of Redemption one last time. Mrs. Pritchard stood in the doorway of the boarding house, arms crossed, watching with an expression Eliza couldn't quite read. The mercantile owner swept debris from his boardwalk without looking up. Catherine Monroe was nowhere to be seen, probably already back at her comfortable ranch, congratulating herself on a charitable $20 given. "I haven't changed my mind," Eliza said. Caleb nodded and offered his hand to help her onto the wagon seat. His palm was rough with calluses, his grip steady and impersonal. He released her the moment she was settled and climbed up beside her, keeping a careful distance between them that Eliza appreciated more than she could say. The wagon lurched into motion, wheels cutting through mud still soft from the storm. Eliza kept her eyes forward, refusing to look back again. Looking back served no purpose. There was only forward now, into whatever came next. They rode in silence for the first mile. The town fell away behind them, replaced by rolling grassland still green from recent rain. Mountains rose on all sides, their peaks touched with early snow that gleamed in the morning sun. It was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way, like the land itself was testing anyone foolish enough to try living here. "Storm hit you hard last night?" Caleb asked, breaking the quiet. "We heard it more than felt it. The boarding house is solid." "Good." He guided the horses around a deep puddle. "Lost part of my barn roof. Nothing that can't be fixed, but it'll mean work." Eliza heard the unspoken question in his words. "I'm not afraid of work." "Didn't figure you were." He glanced at her briefly, then back at the road. "Woman who travels 800 miles with 3 boys in tow doesn't scare easy." "You heard about that too?" "Small town. People talk." Of course they did. Her humiliation was probably still being discussed over breakfast tables and in the mercantile aisles. Poor, desperate widow, rejected by her own family, taking charity from a stranger because she had no other choice. "I'm not charity," she said quietly, surprising herself with the vehemence in her voice. "I'll work for the cabin, pay my way." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. "Didn't say you were charity, but there's no shame in accepting help when it's offered. Pride's a luxury most of us can't afford out here." The words settled over her like a blanket. Not quite comfort, but something close. Behind her, she heard Samuel whisper something to Thomas, heard David's giggle in response. The sound of her children being children, even for a moment, eased something in her chest. "How far is your ranch?" she asked. "Another 3 miles. We'll be there within the hour." 3 miles. The distance that had seemed impossible yesterday with no horse and no hope. Now it was just a measure of time, of minutes ticking past as the wagon carried them toward a future Eliza couldn't begin to imagine. The landscape changed gradually as they traveled. Grassland gave way to scrub pine and juniper. The road, barely more than a track worn by wagon wheels, climbed steadily upward. Eliza caught glimpses of cattle in the distance, their hides glossy with rain, and once she saw an elk standing motionless on a ridge, watching their passage with ancient calm. "That's the north boundary," Caleb said, pointing to a line of fence posts. "Ranch runs about 800 acres. Not much by some standards, but it's good grazing, water year-round from the creek." 800 acres. Eliza tried to imagine that much land and failed. In Missouri, they'd rented 40 acres and considered themselves fortunate. "Do you run it alone?" The question came out before she could consider whether it was too personal. "Mostly. Hire help during roundup and branding, but day-to-day it's just me." He paused. "Gets quiet." The admission hung in the air between them, surprisingly intimate. Eliza understood quiet, had lived in it since Robert died. The kind of silence that pressed down like physical weight, that made even breathing feel too loud. "There," Caleb said, and Eliza followed his gaze to where buildings emerged from a stand of cottonwoods ahead. The ranch house was larger than she'd expected, 2 stories of weathered wood with a wide porch wrapping around the front. The barn Caleb had mentioned stood to the left, and she could see where part of the roof had indeed torn away, leaving exposed beams like broken ribs. There were other structures too, a chicken coop, what looked like a smokehouse, and set apart from everything else, a small cabin with a stone chimney. "That's yours," Caleb said, nodding toward the cabin. "Built it for my foreman years back. He moved on, and it's been empty since." The wagon rolled to a stop in front of the main house. Caleb climbed down and came around to help Eliza, then lowered the boys one by one. David immediately pressed against Eliza's skirts, overwhelmed by the strangeness of everything. Thomas and Samuel stood close together, eyes wide as they took in their new surroundings. "Let me show you the cabin," Caleb said. "Then I'll bring your trunk over." He led them across the yard to the small structure. Up close, Eliza could see it was sturdily built, the logs chinked tight against weather. Caleb pushed open the door and stepped aside to let her enter first. The interior was simple but clean. One large room with a stone fireplace dominating one wall, a pot-bellied stove in the corner, and a sleeping loft accessible by a ladder. There was a table with 2 chairs, a rocking chair by the hearth, shelves along one wall, and a bed frame in the far corner, though no mattress. "Previous tenant took the mattress with him," Caleb said, sounding almost apologetic. "But I've got a spare in the main house. I'll bring it over along with some bedding." Eliza walked slowly through the space, running her hand along the table's worn surface. The floor was swept clean. The windows, though small, let in good light. After the cramped boarding house room and before that the even more cramped wagon journey, it felt like a palace. "There's a pump just outside," Caleb continued. "Water's cold but clean. Privy's behind the cabin. I'll make sure it's stocked with lime. Firewood's in the shed there. Help yourself to what you need." "It's perfect," Eliza heard herself say. "It's rough," Caleb corrected. "But it's sound. Storm didn't touch it." He paused at the threshold. "I'll let you settle in. When you're ready, come to the main house. I'll have some food ready." Then he was gone, his footsteps fading across the yard, leaving Eliza alone with her sons in a stranger's cabin on land she didn't know. For a long moment, no one moved. Then David whispered, "Mama, do we really get to stay here?" The uncertainty in his voice nearly broke her. "For now, sweetheart. For now." "I like it," Samuel announced, already climbing the ladder to investigate the loft. "Thomas, come look. There's space for all of us up here." Thomas didn't move. He stood in the center of the room, his face unreadable, and when he finally spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. "What does he want, Mama? Really?" The same question that had been circling in her own mind. "I don't know," she admitted, "but he gave us shelter when no one else would. That counts for something. Or it means he wants something he isn't saying yet." 9 years old and already so cynical. Eliza wanted to tell him he was wrong, that people could be kind without ulterior motives, but she'd learned the same hard lessons he was learning now. The world wasn't kind. It was transactional. Everyone wanted something. "Then we'll deal with that if it happens," she said instead. "Right now we have a roof over our heads and food being prepared. That's more than we had this morning." Thomas nodded slowly, accepting this logic even if he didn't like it. "I'll help Samuel get the loft ready for sleeping." Eliza waited until both older boys were occupied above before sinking into the rocking chair and letting herself feel the full weight of the morning. She'd put her children in a stranger's care based on nothing but desperation and a worn wedding ring. If she was wrong, if Caleb Hartman was something other than what he appeared, she'd made a terrible mistake. But what choice had there been? The question kept circling back to that. No money, no work, no options. At least here, there was space, air to breathe, a chance, however slim, to figure out what came next. "Mama, can we go outside?" Samuel called down from the loft. "I want to see the horses." "Stay where I can see you from the window," she said. "And don't touch anything without asking first." She heard them scrambling down the ladder, heard the door bang open and their excited voices as they discovered the world outside the cabin. Through the window, she watched them run toward the corral where several horses grazed. They stopped at the fence, keeping their distance but leaning forward with the desperate interest of boys who'd spent too long cooped up.